"Just here for the free food," the alien girl said when the CEO caught her at the banquet. The grand banquet hall buzzed with excitement as diplomats, high-ranking officers, and business moguls filled the air with conversation and laughter. The event was being held in celebration of a new intergalactic trade agreement, and its grandeur was second to none. Earth, at the center of the galaxy's ever-expanding influence, was hosting some of the most powerful beings from across the stars. At the far end of the hall, beneath the shimmering chandeliers, a long table stretched out, covered with delicacies from every known world. Platters of shimmering fruits, spiced meats, and desserts that seemed to glow with an otherworldly radiance filled the space, each more extravagant than the last. Guests dressed in their finest gowns and suits walked past the spread, some of them too proud to notice the humble dishes on the edges. Others looked at the food with quiet longing, as if they had tasted such luxuries only in passing. Anders Braxton stood at the center of it all. His towering frame, crisp suit, and neatly combed hair made him a perfect figurehead for the event. As CEO of Braxton Enterprises, a company that had its fingers in nearly every facet of intergalactic business, he was accustomed to being the center of attention. But tonight, something else seemed to captivate the room. The attention wasn't on him. It was on the spectacle of the grand feast and the extravagant figures walking around, exchanging pleasantries. He sipped his drink slowly, scanning the crowd with practiced ease. His eyes flickered over the faces of the important guests, looking for any sign of trouble, any indication that tonight's proceedings might turn chaotic. He wasn't fond of these types of events, too much show, too little substance. But as a leader of Earth's most powerful business empire, it was his duty to be present, to play the game, and to keep his image pristine. That was when he noticed her. At first, it was a flash, a figure darting between guests with an almost uncanny speed. She was small, wearing an oversized, ill-fitting gown that hung awkwardly on her slight frame. Her greenish skin shimmered in the low light, almost glowing in contrast to the more muted tones of the other guests. She moved with purpose, and though her face was obscured by a long hood, Anders could tell she didn't belong. She had no name tag, no invitation, no entourage. There was something about the way she stood near the food table that immediately drew his attention. She didn't mingle like the others. She wasn't here to make deals, flaunt her connections, or exchange pleasantries with the galaxy's movers and shakers. She was here for one thing, the food. Anders tilted his head. Normally, he wouldn't have given someone like her a second glance. There were always people who crashed events for one reason or another, but something about her stuck out. Her boldness, perhaps. Or maybe it was her complete disregard for the grandeur of the event, as if it was all a backdrop to something more important. Whatever it was, it intrigued him. As he made his way toward her, weaving through clusters of guests, he couldn't help but watch her closely. She was, by all accounts, unremarkable, nothing more than a small, uninvited guest at an exclusive party. But the longer he observed her, the more he realized something odd. She was moving with a sense of urgency, not the awkwardness of someone caught off guard, but the swift motions of someone on a mission. Anders didn't like being caught off guard. She reached the edge of the banquet table, her hands darting over the dishes as though she was picking through gold. With quick, practiced motions, she grabbed a plate, piled it high with food, and slipped away into the shadows of the banquet hall before anyone could notice. Her movements were so swift, so smooth, that Anders had barely realized she was gone before she vanished completely into the crowd. Curiosity gnawed at him. He set his drink down on a nearby table, his mind already calculating the possible reasons for her behavior. Who was she? What was her purpose? And why did she choose tonight to make her appearance? After a brief moment of consideration, Anders decided to find out. Moving swiftly through the crowd, he followed the trail of the mystery woman, not sure what he would do once he caught up with her. She was a puzzle, one that didn't quite fit the pattern of the evening's proceedings. Perhaps she was a rogue diplomat, an undercover agent, or even someone connected to the black market. But none of those possibilities explained her simple, yet deliberate actions. All he knew was that he needed answers. Anders found her again near the far side of the hall, crouched behind a tall column. She had found a quiet corner away from prying eyes, where the food she'd stolen was now spread out before her. She ate quickly, without hesitation, her eyes darting back and forth as if she was expecting someone to catch her at any moment. Anders approached, taking care to remain unnoticed. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but what he found when he spoke to her was nothing like he imagined. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Is there something I can help you with?" The girl froze, a half-chewed bite of some exotic fruit hanging from her lips. She turned toward him, her eyes wide with surprise, as if she hadn't expected to be caught. For a moment, Anders simply looked at her, waiting for her to make a move. She didn't seem like she was going to run, but she didn't seem like she was going to speak either. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and smiled sheepishly, as though the situation was some kind of joke. "Well, I guess you've caught me," she said with a grin. "Just here for the free food." Anders blinked. He hadn't been expecting that. "The free food?" he asked, his voice dripping with both confusion and curiosity. "You know, this is an exclusive event. You're not exactly supposed to be here." The girl's smile widened, a mischievous gleam dancing in her eyes. "Yeah, I figured. But it's not like anyone's paying attention to someone like me, right?" She gestured at her oversized gown, her voice a strange mix of humor and defiance. "Just thought I'd take advantage of the situation. It's not every day I get a chance to eat like this." Anders narrowed his eyes. There was something oddly disarming about her bluntness, as though she wasn't afraid of the social rules that governed this kind of event. And for a moment he saw her not just as an uninvited guest, but as something else entirely, a person who had no interest in the trappings of power, someone who simply wanted a meal. "What's your name?" he asked. She shrugged as if the question didn't matter. "Zara." "Zara," he repeated, the name rolled off his tongue like it was somehow familiar. "I'm Anders Braxton." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't stand up or bow. "Oh, the CEO, I've heard of you." A chuckle escaped Anders, though he quickly silenced it. "I'm sure you have. But you've heard of me in the wrong way, I'm afraid. Why are you here, Zara? What's your story?" Zara tilted her head, clearly sizing him up. "My story? It's not much of a story. I'm just a traveler passing through the galaxy. Some people just want to survive, you know. It's easier to take what you can when people are too busy being important to notice." She said it with such casual conviction that Anders wasn't sure if she was playing a game or telling the truth. Either way, she had an air of independence, a no-nonsense attitude that seemed both refreshing and a little unnerving. "Survive?" he echoed. "Survive from what?" Her eyes flickered away, her smile faltering for just a moment. But she quickly recovered, as if she had rehearsed this moment many times before. "The galaxy's not always kind to people like me. Sometimes you gotta take what you can get." Anders didn't know why, but something about her answer stuck with him. There was a raw honesty in her voice that he hadn't heard in years, not in boardrooms or business deals or political speeches. It was as if Zara, in her own way, had seen the truth of the galaxy in a way most people hadn't. And in that moment, Anders realized he wasn't just talking to an uninvited guest. He was talking to someone who had survived in a world far harsher than his own. Anders watched Zara as she continued eating, her movements quick and efficient, almost as if she was in a hurry to finish before anyone else could stop her. She picked up another piece of fruit, the vivid purple skin gleaming in the soft light of the banquet hall. Her eyes flickered over the food, but there was something else behind her gaze, something distant, almost melancholic. "So what exactly are you doing here?" Anders asked again, trying to pierce the layers of her nonchalant demeanor. She had told him she was just here for the free food, but he knew there was more to her than that. No one crashed a high-profile banquet just to snatch a plate of appetizers, especially not in the way she had done. Zara looked at him for a moment before shrugging, still chewing. Her nonchalant attitude only made him more curious. She had the confidence of someone who didn't care what anyone thought, but Anders couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, perhaps even running from something. "I'm a traveler," she said simply, as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Been hopping from one planet to the next, just trying to get by." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes glinting with a strange mixture of amusement and sorrow. "Sometimes the universe gives you a chance to eat something decent and you take it. Simple as that." Anders couldn't help but chuckle. "You really don't care about being at this banquet, do you?" Zara shook her head, her green skin glistening in the light. "Nope, not at all. Don't get me wrong, the food's great," she added, picking up a delicate pastry from the table. "But I'm not here to mingle with the elites or play nice with the diplomats. I'm just here." Anders stared at her, his mind working. There was something genuine about her bluntness. Most people, especially those who ended up in these kinds of settings, were keen to hide their true intentions. But Zara didn't even seem to try. She was honest in a way that was disarming, and that honesty was strangely refreshing in a room full of people pretending to be something they were. "So, how do you survive?" Anders asked, genuinely interested. Zara had made it clear that she wasn't from the circles that people like him normally interacted with, but that didn't mean she didn't have a story to tell. It was clear she'd seen things that people like him might never understand. Zara's expression shifted then, and for a brief moment, a shadow passed over her face. She set her plate down, the food momentarily forgotten as her eyes wandered across the room. It was as though she was searching for something, or maybe even running from something. "It's not easy," she said, her voice softer now. "You can't just walk into a place like this and expect people to care about you. You've got to find your own way, whether it's stealing food or working odd jobs or sometimes trading what you know for something you need. People don't give you much in this galaxy, but if you're clever enough, you can get by." Anders leaned in, captivated by her story. She spoke with a quiet intensity, as though she had lived through more hardship than most people could imagine. She wasn't just a girl looking for free food. She was someone who had learned to navigate the harshest corners of the galaxy with nothing but her wits and determination. "But why come here? Why this banquet?" Anders pressed, trying to piece together the puzzle. Zara smiled again, though this time there was a hint of something sad in her eyes. "Sometimes you just get tired of the struggle. You see these events, these fancy things, and for a moment you wonder what it would be like to have it all, just to sit back and enjoy what the galaxy has to offer without having to fight for every scrap. So you slip into a banquet like this. Maybe you get a meal. Maybe you get a little conversation. Maybe you get noticed. And then maybe you can find a way out of the life you're stuck in." Anders could hear the longing in her words, the desire for something more. But he also heard the skepticism, the hard-earned wisdom that came from surviving on the edge of the galaxy. It was the voice of someone who had seen enough to know that the world didn't always offer second chances, and if you wanted a better life, you had to take it for yourself. He thought about his own life, his success, his wealth, the power he wielded. It was all built on systems that had little to do with people like Zara. People who scraped by, people who had no safety nets, no privilege, no guarantees. He was used to getting what he wanted, whether it was a deal, a resource, or an alliance. But Zara. She had learned to survive by doing what she had to do, even if that meant sneaking into banquets and taking what she could. "What happened to you?" Anders asked, his voice quieter now. "You said you've been hopping from planet to planet. What brought you here?" Zara's eyes darkened for a moment, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She stood up and moved away from the table, looking out at the shimmering skyline through the large glass windows. The city sprawled out below them, the lights reflecting off the vast stretches of metal and glass that made up the towering skyscrapers. It was a world of wealth, of privilege, of everything that Anders had worked his whole life to build. "It's not easy being from where I'm from," she said softly, her voice distant. "Where I come from, there's no room for people like me. No room for people who are just trying to survive. The galaxy doesn't care about the ones on the edges. The ones who are struggling to get by, who have nothing but the clothes on their backs and the will to keep moving forward." She paused, taking a breath before continuing. "I've seen my people, my family lost to the chaos of war. I've seen entire planets wiped out, nothing but ash and ruins left behind. And all the while, the powerful people of the galaxy sit in their fancy rooms, making decisions about our lives like they're playing a game." Anders felt a flicker of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of confusion. He hadn't been prepared for her to share something so raw, so personal. The weight of her words hung in the air between them. "I didn't come here for the banquet," she continued, her voice steady once more. "I came here because it's a chance to change things, to get close to someone who might know how to make a real difference. Someone who might have the resources to do something for people like me, people who need it the most." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Anders felt as though he was looking at something beyond the surface, a person who had fought for every scrap of life she had. Someone who had seen the galaxy's darkest sides and still managed to survive. "You don't have to tell me all this," Anders said, his voice gentler than it had been all evening. "I wasn't prying into your life, but I get it. I understand more than you think." Zara's gaze softened and a hint of surprise crossed her features. "Really?" she asked, clearly not expecting that response. Anders nodded. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not from the same perspective, but I know what it's like to want something more. To feel like you're stuck in a place where nothing ever changes. Zara tilted her head, considering his words. Then she smiled, though it was tinged with a sense of weary optimism. Maybe you do. Anders didn't speak for a moment, his mind racing as he processed what she had said. There was more to Zara than he had first realized. She wasn't just a girl trying to survive in a harsh world. She was someone who had seen everything the galaxy had to offer, and had learned that, sometimes, the best way to move forward was to take things into your own hands. You know, Anders said slowly, you might be onto something. You've got more guts than most of the people I've met in this room tonight. Zara chuckled softly, glancing at the empty plates before them. Maybe, but then again, it's not all about guts. Sometimes it's about knowing when to take what's right in front of you. Anders smiled back at her, a spark of respect in his eyes. It was clear now that Zara wasn't just another uninvited guest at a banquet. She was someone who had a deeper understanding of the universe, someone who had lived through the struggles that most people could only read about. And somehow, in that moment, he knew that her journey wasn't over yet. Zara stood by the glass window, staring out at the city below. The lights of the skyscrapers flickered like distant stars, reflecting the quiet hum of power and wealth. She had been here long enough to understand the world she was looking at, but it still felt alien to her. She had been raised in places where every day was a struggle, where survival came first, and luxury was something people read about in books. Now, in this towering building on Earth, surrounded by glittering chandeliers and polished floors, she couldn't help but feel like an intruder in someone else's world. Anders Braxton, the man who had come over to speak to her, was still standing nearby. He hadn't left, despite the fact that most people in his position would have ignored her by now, just another uninvited guest who didn't belong. But something about her had caught his attention, and he had stayed. "Do you always sneak into places like this?" Anders asked, breaking the silence between them. His voice was casual, but there was a certain curiosity in it. Zara turned away from the window, her eyes thoughtful. She looked at Anders as though weighing her response. There was something about him that made her feel as though she could trust him, something beyond his business suit and his towering frame. Maybe it was the way he had listened to her, or how he hadn't treated her like just another problem to solve. "Not always," she replied with a grin, "but it's been a while since I've had a decent meal that didn't come from a street vendor or the back of a food truck. Figured I'd take my chances." Anders raised an eyebrow. "So this is all just about food for you," Zara chuckled. "Well, it's part of it. I don't exactly have the luxury of eating like this every day, but I'm not just here for a free meal. There's something else." She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. The past few years of her life had been a blur of survival, bouncing from one world to the next. But here in this city, with Anders standing beside her, it almost felt like she had a chance to catch her breath, to make a decision that might actually change the course of her life. "Let's just say," she said slowly, "I've been looking for someone who can help. Someone with the kind of resources that can make a difference for people like me." Anders frowned, clearly intrigued. "You came here because you think I can help?" Zara nodded. "I didn't come here to ask for handouts or charity. But I've heard things about you, your company, your reach, the power you have to influence things. There are people out there, people who don't have the kind of protection or resources that others do. I want to help them. I want to make sure they don't end up forgotten in some backwater planet or buried under the rubble of a war." Anders was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. The weight of her intentions hung heavily in the air. She wasn't asking for a handout. She wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for something much harder to give, his help in changing the system, in making a real difference. "You're asking me to go against everything this company stands for?" Anders said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "You want me to put resources toward people who have nothing, people who are struggling to survive?" Zara nodded again, her gaze unwavering. "I don't expect you to do it all at once. But if there's a way to make the galaxy a little bit better, even just for a few, then it's worth it. You have the power to do that. You just have to choose whether or not you're going to." Anders wasn't used to people speaking to him like this, straightforward, with no games or hidden agendas. It was refreshing, but also a little unsettling. Most of the people who came to him were looking for favors, deals, or advantages that benefited them. Zara wasn't asking for that. She wasn't playing a game. She was laying her heart bare, asking for something bigger. You really believe it's that simple? Anders asked, a small frown creasing his brow. You think I can just wave a magic wand and make the galaxy better for people like you? People who have been abandoned by everyone else? Zara's expression softened, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. I don't expect you to have a magic wand, but you have influence. You have connections. You can make things happen. Anders felt the weight of her words settle over him. He had spent years building his empire, establishing himself as one of the most powerful men in the galaxy. He had the resources, the reach, the people who would do anything he asked. But he had always used that power for personal gain, for the success of his company, for the wealth that had made him who he was. He had never really stopped to think about what it would mean to use that power to help others. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, he said quietly. I've built my company on deals and alliances, not on charity. Zara took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. It's not charity, she said, her voice firm. It's a chance to change things. You don't have to do it alone. You have the ability to make a real difference, if you care enough to try. For the first time in a long while, Anders felt uncertain. He had built his entire life on the idea that power was something to be earned, something to be protected and used to his advantage. But Zara was asking him to rethink everything, to see the galaxy not as a place where the powerful dominated, but as a place where even the powerless could have a voice. He wasn't sure what it would take to make that change. He wasn't sure if he could. But there was something in Zara's words, something in the way she looked at him with such raw, unfiltered sincerity that made him pause. All right, Anders said, his voice steady now. Let's say you're right. Let's say I want to help. What does that look like? Zara smiled, a glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes. It starts small. Maybe it's funding initiatives to help displaced families. Maybe it's offering protection to the people who have nowhere else to turn. It doesn't have to be one big thing. It can be a series of small actions that add up over time. Anders felt a spark of something deep within him. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one that had nothing to do with business deals or power plays. This was something different, something bigger. All right, he repeated. We'll start small. For the rest of the evening, they talked, exchanging ideas and plans. Zara spoke of the places she had seen, the people she had met, people who had been abandoned by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. She told Anders about her travels, about the wars she had witnessed, and the worlds she had visited where nothing but destruction remained. It was clear that Zara had seen more of the galaxy than anyone in this room, more than most people would ever understand. Anders, for his part, listened. He had always been a man of action, always focused on what could be done. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about profits or market share. He wasn't thinking about business at all. For the first time, he was thinking about people, the ones who didn't have the privilege of luxury, the ones who didn't have access to the resources he took for granted. As the night wore on, the grand banquet continued around them, but Anders and Zara had created their own space in the midst of it all. They spoke like equals, sharing ideas and visions, pushing each other to think bigger, to think beyond the walls of their comfortable worlds. The more they talked, the more Anders realized something. The galaxy didn't have to be as unfair as it was. There were ways to make things better. And maybe, just maybe, he had the power to be part of that change. When the banquet finally came to an end, Anders looked at Zara one last time. She had come here for food, but she was leaving with something far more valuable, a chance. A chance for something new, a chance to make a real difference. We'll start tomorrow, Anders said, his voice resolute, and we'll make it count. Zara nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I knew you'd get it. And with that, the two of them stepped out of the banquet hall, ready to begin a journey that would change the course of their lives, and the lives of countless others, forever. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, plans, and adjustments. Anders Braxton was used to making deals, to negotiating terms and conditions with the sharpest minds in the galaxy. But this was different. This wasn't about making money or securing power. It was about making an impact. It was about using his influence for something beyond his own ambitions. Zara's words had stuck with him. They had stayed with him in the days following their conversation, when he found himself sitting in his office late into the night, staring out at the city below, wondering what it would take to really make a difference. He had thought about the people she had mentioned, those who lived on the fringes, the ones who didn't have the luxury of wealth or power. He had seen the reports, heard the stories, but it had always felt like a distant problem, something far removed from his own world. But Zara had made it personal. When he had agreed to help, he hadn't fully understood what he was stepping into. He had thought it would be simple, throwing money at problems, creating some projects here and there, maybe offering a few handouts. But it was far more complicated than that. There were layers to the issue that he hadn't anticipated. There were political barriers, financial obstacles, and most importantly, there were deeply entrenched systems of inequality that didn't just need fixing. They needed to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Anders was realizing that helping the people Zara had spoken about wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. It wasn't just about sending supplies or opening a few programs. It was about challenging the very foundation of the galaxy's power structures, and that was no small task. But for the first time in his life, Anders felt like he had a purpose beyond his company. He had a mission, one that mattered. Zara had been his guide through this new world. She wasn't a politician or a philanthropist, but she knew what it meant to survive. She had spent her entire life navigating the galaxy's dark underbelly, and now she was ready to do something about it. Her experiences in the outer colonies, in war-torn worlds and forgotten cities, gave her a perspective Anders could never have understood on his own. She had lived through things most people couldn't imagine, and that made her the perfect person to show him what needed to be done. They spent days strategizing. Zara spoke of the refugee camps on distant planets, the communities ravaged by conflict, and the families who had been abandoned to fend for themselves. She spoke of the children who had grown up in the shadows, with no access to education or health care, and the men and women who had lost everything, left with nothing but their wits to survive. Anders listened. He listened to her stories, to the pain and frustration in her voice, and he realized that this wasn't just a charity mission. This was a call to arms. It wasn't about helping the poor or the weak because they deserved a handout. It was about fighting for those who had been left behind by a system that only cared about power, wealth, and control. He found himself immersed in the work. He had always prided himself on being a problem solver, but this felt different. Every step forward felt like an uphill battle. There were meetings with diplomats, politicians, and leaders who didn't want to hear what he was trying to do. They didn't want to see the people Zara was talking about, the ones whose lives had been destroyed by the endless cycles of war, greed, and corruption. At times, it felt like Anders was pushing against an immovable wall. But Zara was always there, reminding him why it mattered, why he couldn't stop now. She was the driving force, the spark that kept him going. She had been in the trenches, and now she was asking him to help pull others out. One afternoon, Zara and Anders found themselves in a small conference room, sitting across from a group of galactic leaders. They were seated in plush chairs, surrounded by the comfort of wealth, while the people they were discussing barely had enough to survive. Anders could see the disparity clearly now. These people, the ones sitting across from him, didn't understand what it meant to go without. They didn't know what it felt like to have nothing. The conversation was tense. Zara had just finished detailing the conditions on a planet where entire villages had been wiped out by a series of corporate mining operations. The planet's resources had been drained, its people exploited, and now it was nothing but a barren wasteland. The leaders sitting across from Anders seemed indifferent to her words, and Anders could feel his frustration building. "This can't continue," Zara said, her voice calm but firm. "These people have lost everything. The companies that did this need to be held accountable. The systems that allowed this to happen need to be reformed. And the people who have been hurt the most, need help, and they need it now." One of the leaders, a tall, silver-skinned alien with an air of superiority, leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I understand your concerns, Ms. Zara, but you must understand that these are complicated matters. Resources are scarce. We cannot afford to simply give away what little we have left. Our priorities must remain on the stability of the galaxy as a whole." Zara's eyes narrowed, but she didn't back down. "Stability?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Is that what you call it? Is that what you're calling the destruction of entire civilizations for the sake of profit? The people on that planet don't care about your stability. They care about their homes, their families, their future." Anders could feel the tension in the room grow. The leaders were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats, but they were still holding their ground. They were used to being in control, to making the decisions that shaped the galaxy. They weren't used to someone like Zara calling them out for their complacency. "We're not talking about charity," Anders said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're talking about justice. We're talking about accountability, and we're talking about the kind of change that needs to happen if we want this galaxy to survive." The room went silent. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Anders could sense that Zara was ready to push harder, to fight for what was right, but he knew they needed to pick their battles. This wasn't the time for grand speeches or fiery arguments. This was about strategy, about finding a way to make the galaxy's leaders understand that they couldn't continue turning a blind eye. "We're not asking for a handout," Anders continued. "We're asking for a chance to rebuild, to heal the damage that's been done. If you want the galaxy to truly prosper, you need to start with the people who have been left behind." The leader who had spoken earlier seemed to consider Anders' words for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I will consider your proposal," he said, his tone cool. "But know this, you will face resistance. There are powers that will not be pleased with what you're suggesting." Zara didn't flinch. "We'll deal with that when the time comes." After the meeting, Anders and Zara walked out of the conference room in silence. The halls of the building were eerily quiet, the polished floors reflecting the cold light from above. Anders felt the weight of the conversation hanging over him, the tension from the room still lingering in the air. "They'll never understand," Zara said softly, her voice filled with a quiet anger. "They don't care about the people. They don't care about what's happening out there." "I know," Anders replied, his voice thoughtful, "but that doesn't mean we stop. It just means we need to find another way." Zara nodded, her eyes set with determination. "We'll keep pushing. We'll make them see. They can ignore us now, but eventually they'll have no choice but to listen." Anders looked at her, admiring her resolve. She had been right all along. This wasn't about charity or goodwill. It was about something bigger, a shift in how the galaxy was run, a change in how power was distributed. He wasn't just fighting for the people Zara had spoken about. He was fighting for a future where everyone had a chance to thrive, where no one was left behind. Anders didn't know exactly how they would get there, but for the first time in a long time, he knew they had to try. As they exited the building, Zara turned to him. "You know this isn't going to be easy," Anders smiled. "I didn't expect it to be," Zara grinned back. "Good. Because if it were easy, we wouldn't be doing it right." With that, they walked off into the unknown, ready to take on the challenges ahead. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Anders Braxton had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced before. The meetings grew more intense, the stakes higher. Zara was by his side every step of the way, guiding him through the complexity of the galaxy's fractured systems. Together, they met with representatives from distant planets, strategizing ways to funnel resources to the people who needed them the most. They talked about rebuilding infrastructure, providing food and medical supplies, and ensuring that those who had been forgotten would no longer be overlooked. But every victory, they claimed, seemed to come with a new battle. There were those who fought them at every turn, corporations who saw the proposed reforms as a threat to their profits, political leaders who feared losing their power, and even some of the more conservative factions of society who didn't want things to change. Zara had warned Anders about the resistance they would face, but the reality was still sobering. For every step forward, they seemed to take 2 steps back, but Anders wasn't discouraged. He had faced challenges before, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that power was not something you gave up easily. He had the resources, and now he had the will. It was time to use both. One evening, after a particularly heated negotiation with a council of trade representatives, Anders sat in his office, staring out over the city. The lights from the towering skyscrapers stretched out before him, a reminder of how far he had come. But tonight the view didn't bring him the satisfaction it once did. He had everything he needed: money, power, influence, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Zara had been right. There was more to life than power. There was more to success than wealth. He had spent so many years chasing the wrong things. Now, for the first time in his life, he was chasing something that mattered. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Anders sighed and leaned back in his chair. The last few months had been a blur of work and pressure, and he hadn't taken a moment to just breathe. He picked up his communicator and sent a message to Zara asking if she wanted to meet. It didn't take long for her to reply. "We've got a lot to talk about." "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Zara arrived at his office just as the evening light began to fade. She walked in with her usual quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Anders. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned back in her chair. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a raised eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" Anders rubbed his temples. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. Every time we make a breakthrough, it feels like there's another roadblock in the way. People don't want things to change. They don't want to lose their grip on the power they've built. I feel like I'm fighting an uphill battle." Zara didn't immediately respond. She just sat there watching him closely, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Of course they don't want things to change," she said, her voice calm but firm. "People in power never want to lose it. They'll fight tooth and nail to keep their control. But that doesn't mean you stop. If you really want to make a difference, you have to keep pushing. You can't let them wear you down." Anders sighed. "I get that, but it's exhausting. I've never been in a fight like this before." Zara leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Neither have I, but this is why we're doing it. Because no one else will. If we don't fight for these people, if we don't take a stand, no one else will either." Anders looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. There was a depth to her, a quiet strength. She wasn't just a survivor, someone who had learned how to navigate the galaxy's harsh realities. She was a fighter, and more than that, she was a leader. He had always known that she had something special, but tonight, for the first time, he truly understood what it was. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't stop now. We can't stop now. I've come this far, and I won't let it be for nothing." Zara gave him a small, approving nod. "Good, because this fight isn't over, it's just beginning." The following week brought a new development. After months of resistance, Anders and Zara had finally secured a deal with a coalition of planets that would allow them to distribute much-needed resources to the outer colonies. It wasn't the sweeping victory they had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. They had managed to secure a promise from the leaders of several major planets to fund health care, education, and rebuilding efforts for those who had been devastated by war and poverty. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was something, and it was a start. Anders sat in his office once again, the weight of the recent victory settling on him. The deal wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was a significant breakthrough. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were making real progress. Zara walked in, a wide grin on her face. "Well, it's not the galaxy-changing solution we hoped for, but it's something." Anders smiled back. "It's a lot more than nothing." Zara nodded, taking a seat across from him. "This isn't going to be easy, though. We've still got a long way to go, but if we keep pushing, we can make a real difference." Anders looked at her, his mind racing. "I know, and I'm ready. I'm more ready than I've ever been." Zara's smile softened. "Good, because we're not done yet." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The fight was long and difficult, but Anders and Zara never wavered. They continued to press forward, slowly but surely making headway in a galaxy that seemed determined to remain the same. With every success, they faced new challenges, but they never stopped fighting, never stopped pushing for change. As they traveled from planet to planet, speaking with leaders, meeting with the people they were trying to help, Anders began to understand what Zara had been talking about. He saw the faces of the people who had been forgotten, the ones who had been left behind by the systems that were supposed to protect them. He saw the children who didn't know what it was like to go to school, the families who had lost everything to corporate greed, and the refugees who had nowhere else to turn. And it changed him. He began to see his empire in a new light. The wealth, the power, the influence, it all seemed so small compared to the lives of the people who needed help. The world he had spent his entire life building was a world built on the backs of others. But now, he saw that he could do something about it. He could use his position, his power, to make a difference. Together, he and Zara began to form alliances with more planets, more leaders, and more communities. They pushed forward, determined to create a new future, one where the people who had been forgotten could finally have a chance. Anders knew it wasn't going to be easy. He knew there would be setbacks and challenges along the way. But as he looked out at the stars, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for something that mattered. He wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting for a future, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that future a reality. Zara stood beside him, her eyes filled with the same determination. They had started this journey together, and they would see it through no matter what. Because they knew that the fight for change wasn't just a battle, it was a mission, and together they would win it.